everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for organizing this event. Thank you, Xin, for being here to chat about your fabulous book with me. So I think sort of as the title of this webinar implies, right, what our books have in common, and where they really sort of at their core overlap is that both of our books not only talk about Chinese nationalism, but I think really challenge current histories and notions about what we often think about of Chinese nationalism. And so I thought maybe I would just start by talking a little bit about my book and what my book does, and then toss it over to Xin and let him talk a little bit more, and then we'll continue to sort of talk about these points at which our books overlap. I remember when I was in graduate school years and years ago, a friend not in Chinese history asked me, like, are there new books being written about 20th century China that aren't about Chinese nationalism? And I was like, well, there are, but there's not as many as you might think, because it's a really, really hot topic. It's something that a lot of people have a lot to say about, in part because sort of our primary sources are really focused on what it means to be Chinese and what it means to sort of create and be a part of the Chinese nation. And my book sort of tackles this question of sort of what is the Chinese nation and what does it mean to belong to it and identify with it from the perspective of language. Now, there have been histories of nationalism and language in China. There have been histories of nationalism and language around the world. But in China, overwhelmingly, the focus of these histories has been focused on efforts to create, standardize, and promulgate its current national language, what we often in English call Mandarin, which is a language spoken on or based upon the language of the capital, Beijing. If anyone in the audience has taken a Chinese language course in the UK, it is very likely that this is the language you would have learned, right? So this is the focus of most histories of language and nationalism in China. What my book does, rather than approach this question of what is the relationship between language and nationalism in China, is rather than focusing on the national language, mine focuses on how all of these other Chinese languages that are spoken throughout the country became central to how people identify with their own nation. In Chinese, we would call these languages fangyan, which literally means sort of language of place, and includes some really well-known ones, including, say, Cantonese, Shanghainese, Taiwanese, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these other Chinese languages that are commonly spoken throughout the country and throughout the world, right? In sort of the Chinese diaspora, or in places like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. Now, these languages are often left out of stories of Chinese nation building, and I think that's often for two reasons. One is that once the government really began promulgating Mandarin as the sole representative of the Chinese nation, these languages were more or less deemed sort of non-standard, and therefore outside of the list of things that make Chinese national identity. The second reason that they're often left out is because in everyday, sort of conversation, in academia, in policy, they're very rarely thought of as languages at all, and in fact are often called dialects. Indeed, the title of my book is Dialect and Nationalism in China, a choice that was made largely because there are almost no other common translations of the word fangyan into English. It's almost always translated as dialect. And it makes sense to not focus on dialect and nationalism because dialects are often seen as variants of a broader Chinese language. They're associated with the local, right? They're just sort of, they're subsidiary, right? And therefore often not imagined as important. But what my book does, right, is that it shows that fangyan were actually really central to understanding Chinese nationalism. And that's for two reasons. First is that in the process of creating a Chinese national language, there was a lot of discussion of what to do with these fangyan, which is what almost everybody in the country spoke, right? Very few people spoke the national language. And therefore, this was not sort of like preordained that there would be a national language. This was a process. And so understanding how these people who really did want to promulgate the national language as the sole representative of the Chinese nation grappled with fangyan is really important to understanding how they were imagining what China was. At the same time, however, my book also argues that fangyan were central to nation building because there were these other groups, poets, playwrights, revolutionaries, and activists who really sort of actively believed and still believe that their mother tongues, these Chinese fangyan, are actually sort of more Chinese and more sort of central to their own national identity as Chinese than the national language, either because there's this narrative that they have that these local languages like Cantonese have deeper historic ties to Chinese history, or languages like Sichuanese, right, are more sort of authentic representations of the Chinese people and their emotions and their selves, or that they're more culturally connected to the heart of Chinese nation, or all of these other sort of narratives. But the sort of core here is that there are a lot of people who saw fangyan as sort of more centrally Chinese than the national language. So what my book does is it looks at these two sort of narratives about what fangyan are. One is that they're sort of subsidiary and non-standard. The other is that they're sort of more culturally and authentically connected to what China is than the national language. And I look at how these narratives sort of essentially sort of inform one another and evolve over the course of the 20th century to kind of create what it means to be Chinese through language. So that's where my book sort of tackles this question of the history of Chinese nationalism. I'll go ahead and throw it to Xin and let him explain a little bit about his terrific book.
Thank you very much, Gina. This is a wonderful book. I spent some time reading it, and I really fell in love with your book. This is a great book. And if you listen to what Gina said, right? So in her book, there's this tension. There's this tension between two different understandings of nationalism. One is from the elite side, right? People who are trying to decide what the language for China should be, and the other is from the side of the other part, right? The people who are not necessarily with the state, they're not necessarily studying China in that way, right? So it's a contradiction. It's a tension. This is the reason I love her book so much. But in my case, I guess my story is a little bit different. So my story is on the other side. So if Gina's book is talking about this very dynamic history of shaping Chinese identity, I'm looking at the resistance. In other words, my book is like the anti-history of Chinese nationalism. So I'm looking in my. Let me first start to talk about introduce my book a little bit, because here her book is already out, right? It's a big sale, right? It's really wonderful, and my book is not out yet. So I feel that I should say a few words about my own book. The title of my book is called World History and National Identity in China, the 20th Century. So in this book, I talk about how 4 generations of Chinese educated elites wrote about the world and world history over the course of the 20th century. And these people are gentry scholars in Qing, academic professionals in the Republic of China, thought workers of the early People's Republic, so 知识工作者, right? Academic professionals and thought workers, and later the experts and the specialists in the 1980s and 1990s. And of course, this book is not just about these people and ideas. It is also a history of knowledge production, right? So in that book, I talk about 3 stages of development of world history into academic field of teaching and research. So the rise of amateur world historical writing in late Qing, the inclusion of world history as a mandatory teaching component in the school curricula in the Republic, and the establishment of world history as a research field from the early People's Republic to the 1980s. Throughout this process, these historians, these scholars, they're negotiating the relationship between national identification and the global outlook in their teaching and research. And this is the entry point through which I study Chinese nationalism. And I'm arguing that Chinese nationalism is very complex, right? It's not necessarily a very subjective process, building up something, but it can also be a tool by which the people in China embrace sort of a defensive mechanism, especially for the Chinese intellectuals and historians try to protect their endangered intellectual autonomy. So that's the point that I'm talking about Chinese nationalism. And in the book, I look at 3 specific issues. So this goes back to what Gina mentioned, right? So when people are talking about Chinese nationalism, everybody have heard about something, right? And especially today when we're talking about Chinese nationalism, a lot of people tell me, are you beating a dead horse? This is, we know everything about it. But in my case, I guess there are three things that I try to engage a conversation, right? So one is the relationship between the Chinese tradition and the modernity. So there's this sort of understanding, traditional China is an isolated society, is stagnant by nature, is against progress, it's against the foreign ideas. And in my research, I'm not saying this is totally wrong, but I have some very powerful concrete examples against it. So I'm looking at the moment of the beginning of the 20th century. During the time, some Confucian scholars wrote about the world in a very holistic way, arguing, people in the West, people in China, we're the same. We have the same sense of humanity, and we have the same sense of intelligence. So in other words, right, the beginning of this sort of, if we call that global nature or global identity in China, actually came from the lineage of Confucianism, right? The evolution of Confucianism in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is one point. I'm having a conversation with the sort of traditional understanding of Chinese nationalism. And the second issue is a lot of people say, Chinese nationalism is a state project. It's a state engineered project, right? In the past, there was this debate. I think probably Gina writes about it. This debate, some people say the communist movement in China is first and foremost a nationalist movement. But in my case, at least in my two chapters about 1950s, it's not necessarily such a story because in the 1950s, the communist state was trying to, introduce Marxism, and based on the assumption that Marxism is universal. It applies to China, it applies to Europe, it applies to Africa. And they do so, right, through pressure. They're trying to control the knowledge production of history in China, and they're trying to popularize this idea. And a lot of Chinese historians are resisting, but how can you do that? Because you're being controlled, right? And in that way, a lot of historians went to this argument. They say China is different. China is a unique case in world history, and therefore, Marxism, I'm not sure if it can apply to the study of Chinese history. So this is the second issue I'm dealing with in my book, right, in terms of nationalism. And the third issue here is in China. I was educated in China. I grew up in China. And oftentimes we celebrate these moments, the birthday of Chinese nationalism. For example, the May 4th movement. So there's tendency people think that the Chinese nationalism has a birthday, or has levels. In that case, going back to Gellner, right? But in my research, I feel that the rise of Chinese nationalism is a long and a contingent process. In other words, this process is not necessarily one-dimensional. You can see the rise of Chinese nationalism, but you can see the fall of Chinese nationalism, and then it probably will come back, right? So here, in the chapter about Republican China, I'm dealing with three people, three historians who are all educated in the United States: Chen Hengzhe, He Bingsong, and Lei Haizong. And each of them wrote about the world. And from 1920s all the way to 1950s, you can see their change. In the beginning, Chen Hengzhe said, the biggest problem in the world is imperialism. And our solution to it is internationalism. We have to embrace internationalism, and we have to promote international solidarity, right? So internationalism is a solution to imperialism. And a couple of years later, He Bingsong would argue in the 1930s, our solution to the problem of imperialism is nationalism. And then 10 years later, Lei Haizong will say, well, this is a time of war, 1940. Japan was invading us, so our solution should be cultural fascism. But by the time of 1950s, Lei Haizong basically became this liberal figure speaking against the Chinese government, saying we need the intellectual autonomy, we need the freedom. So you can see the story of Chinese nationalism, the rise of it, the fall of it is not one-dimensional. And I believe these are the 3 points, right? These are the 3 issues through which I'm engaging in a conversation with Chinese nationalism.
That's so fascinating, Xin, and
Thanks.
I so I'm so sort of like excited and moved by this, because I think that you're right that that even though there's all of these books about Chinese nationalism, it's still sort of really fundamentally misunderstood, and there's still this sense that it is homogenous, it is state-led, it is state-drone, and that there's not these sort of like critics, or when we focus on critics, it's always people who are just sort of like fit this model of sort of like resistor or protester and these kinds of things, when there's other kinds of ways that people are carving out their own narratives about what these kind of ideas mean. And actually sort of your story about these intellectuals in the 1950s, it reminds me of, so I write a part of a chapter about a state-run dialects or fangyan survey in the 1950s. And the idea here, right, was to actually create a basis of knowledge about Chinese local languages for the purposes of teaching people the national language, right? And so they had to go and they had to survey all of these fangyan throughout the country, and then create handbooks on, like, if you speak like Taishanhua, right, like the language of Taishan, how would you learn Mandarin, right? And so it was a sort of this state-run project, and I interviewed a man who at the time was in his 20s, and he did one of these surveys for this government project, and I asked him, I'm like, what made you do that? And he was like, I don't know, I was in my early 20s and cared about languages. I thought languages were cool, and it was a job, right? And so I mean, I think it's one of these things where there are sort of like, there are collaborators with these processes that aren't always sort of like collaborators in the sense that we think of them. And then there are resistors to these processes that are not always resistors in the way that we think about them. And I think what's really sort of striking to me about both your book and hopefully mine, it's weird to call my own book striking, but you know, is that I think that there are some really good transferable lessons to take here, right? Is that one of the things that I think is also sort of misunderstood about Chinese nationalism is you bring up these intellectuals who are arguing that China is unique. And that narrative is common, right? That there's nothing that sort of we can take from China and is transferable. And sort of thinking of my own book and thinking about how what I think these books can tell us, not just about China, right, but about the rest of the world, is that there's a really common presumption that a national language creates a nation. It's a narrative that I think I don't know if I call it. I think a lot of people call it this peasants into Frenchmen narrative, based upon the 1970s book by Eugene Weber, called Peasants into Frenchmen, which is, you know, you take peasants, teach them French, they become Frenchmen, right? And I think that narrative is really common around the world. And I mean, so I'm giving this talk from the United States, and there is a really sort of strong presumption among the general population that part of what it means to be American is to speak standard American English, right? And we have a lot of sort of like very, very sort of like deep-rooted discursive tension and struggle over this. And I think what my book really tries to highlight here is how there are people who very strongly believe that speaking Sichuanese is a core part of being Chinese, not just Sichuanese, right? Like not just from Sichuan, but Chinese, right? And I think that this sort of like this opening up of that is something that I think we can sort of more broadly extend to studies of nationalism and how we think about it around the world. I don't know, Xin, what do you think?
Yeah, this is absolutely a great point. I absolutely agree with what you said, and I really enjoy the part that you wrote about this issue, right? And I feel somehow both of us are being influenced by some global literature, for example, post-colonial studies. And it seems that I also love Eugene Weber, but he belongs to the older generation, right? So here, I guess the issue here, the central issue is when we're looking at the state and society, right? When we're trying to make sense of the relationship between these two, and there's this sort of understanding that the state has all the knowledge, right? State is powerful, and the society is innocent, right? It's passive. But it seems that the recent literature is pointing out to the other direction, that there's a lot of agency among people, right? Especially the ordinary people. And in my case, I also ran into similar cases like this. So, for example, 1950s, right? The state in China was powerful, right? So it had a very clear agenda to control everything in terms of knowledge production, the field of knowledge production in history, because there's clear political goal to do that, to pursue that. But the question here is, by what can you control people, right? So you have Marxism, but do you think of Marxism, the knowledge system is perfect? It's not, right? So there are holes in it. So when we're looking at the interesting debates, right, that are taking place during the time, oftentimes these debates are not taking place at the center of that knowledge system, rather in the periphery, right? So in my book, I'm writing about the debate of the Asiatic mode of production. I'm not sure people heard of that, right? The Asiatic mode of production. So basically, we know when we're looking at how world history is being written according to Marxist ideology, world history is divided into 5 stages, right? In the beginning, it's primitive society, and then slave society, after that, feudal society, and then capital society. Of course, it's future, it comes revolution after that, right? But somehow, somewhere, right, Marx wrote one simple sentence. He said, well, maybe there's this Asiatic mode production. And he has no explanation on that at all. So what's that? It just opens up the huge, right, conversation in China, not just in the 1950s, but in the 1920s, 1980s, 1990s. So a lot of people are, studying this topic, passionately debating about this topic because there's agency, because this is a place where the Communist ideology doesn't hold, right? It opens up the possibility and the imagination for the people in China, even the economy themselves, to be Marxist. And this kind of conversation eventually, right? So in the 1950s, I'm looking at the debate between the two individuals. One is Lei Haizong, one is Lin Zhichun, the other is Tong Shuye. And debate in the 1950s is very much operating within the framework of Marxist ideology. So none of them was trying to challenge the system. But in the 1980s, you can see this sort of conversation gradually was evolving into very strong nationalistic discourse. So I guess this is the way we're looking at the shared literature in our two books, right? We're looking at the relationship between the state and the society through the perspective of knowledge production.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think sort of. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm waiting for a response to that because I see so much similarities between two books, right?
There is, and I think I love your point about how sort of these ideologies can be flexible, and so I teach undergraduates about Chinese history, and one of the things that is sort of so fascinating to talk to them about is sort of what Marxism is, and I find that a lot of people, like sort of my students or just like sort of everyday people, love to talk about, like, is China communist, is it Marxist, and I think that what your book gets at is how these sort of ideas and these ideologies, they're not just sort of borrowed, they're really translated, and translated in sort, and like translation is a really sort of creative process, and so for sort of my historical people, right? Your historical people are focused on this statement of the Asiatic mode of production. For us, or for me and my book, right, there was this pamphlet that Stalin published in 1951 on linguistics. And it was very much sort of like, it's written as this big sort of pronouncement of what language is and how it connects to society. And it has its roots in sort of very specific debates and purges going on in the Soviet Union. But it gets translated into China. And I think what I see happening is this enormous amount of creativity with what Marxism and linguistics means, in that like if taken sort of at face value, right, he has this statement where he says essentially that like this is a language, this is a dialect. Languages belong to nations, and dialects do not, right? And there is this problem that is sort of put there in that Chinese fangyan don't act like dialects in a lot of the sense, right? In the sense that they're not mutually in like Cantonese and Mandarin are about as different as, say, Portuguese and French. And so to say that there's just sort of variants of each other doesn't linguistically make sense, right? And so they're looking at this pamphlet, and it's like, we want to frame fangyan as not being sort of like its own nation. Like, we don't want to talk about a Cantonese nation because that doesn't make sense in our contexts. But we also know that these aren't like dialects in the linguistic sense. So what do we do with this, right? And so they come up with these entire ways of talking about why, say, Mongol is a language, but or say Tibetan is a language, but Tibet is not a nation, right? And so like they're coming up with all of these sort of really fascinating discursive strategies, right, to make this ideology work for their context, right? And it's really sort of a creative process, and I think that it's a good lesson to be thinking about more broadly. In that, one of the things that I think is really sort of critical that historians bring to the table when we talk about places like China is that we don't hold up a yardstick and be like, this is Marxism, and if you hit this, you're Marxist, and if you don't, you're not Marxist, you're a fake Marxist. Like, we don't do that, right? We're sort of, what I think your book does, and what my book tries to do, is to say, okay, these people are calling this Marxist. What does that mean, right, in a Chinese context? And how does that shape lived reality? Because when we frame a fangyan as a dialect, and we frame Tibetan or Manchu or all of these other languages as languages, right? That shapes structures, right? That matters. And so I think that's sort of what I think is really, I think, an important sort of model for how we should talk about things like ideology in a place like China.
Yeah, and also I like the way you're talking about this sort of connection. When I was reading your book, I was thinking, is this a book of history of intellectual ideas? This is society. This is politics. So how can I phrase it, right? So where do I place it? But I really like the way you're doing this because you're looking at this like complex nature of the sort of relationship between society, politics, individuals, right, elites, and ordinary people. I really love the stories about teaching demonstrations. You mentioned these teaching demonstrations activities, and some of these teaching demonstrations became modeled ones for the whole nation, right? So this, you can see that by talking about these issues, you are looking at the intersection, right, between knowledge, practice, politics, and people, right? I really enjoy things like this. And in my own work, I'm also looking into issues like that because when I'm looking at the 1950s, right, when I'm looking at how the communist state controlled the field of knowledge production, it's not easy because by 1949, right, there were not many communists in the higher education sectors in China, right? So for them, they came from the countryside. They had to take over, but oftentimes they did not have enough people to do it, right? They had to rely on the people who came from the past to help them to with this enterprise. And in this process, it creates lots of holes, lots of confusion. And sometimes you can see that people were actually trying to manipulate the goal of the social state. But I see a lot of parallels between our two books, and I really feel excited about it.
Yeah, and I actually was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things that I sort of struggle to teach, I think, and your book, I think, goes into really beautifully. And so to let sort of the audience know is this idea of sort of what Confucianism is in the world, right? Like, how do we think about like what this ideology is, and how, or ideology, religion, philosophy, whatever it is. This is something that my students love to ask me. They're like, is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Right? And it leads to such fascinating discussions. And I think sort of what some of your earlier chapters do is talk a little bit about this, about sort of where does this fit in. And I think this is especially critical to understanding, like, thinking about what China is, right? Because I think that I remember when sort of COVID was just happening, there was a lot of discussion about how Confucianism fits into public health, and it was often very, I would say, haphazardly done. Right? Is that like sort of like Taiwan's a success because of Confucianism or something like that? And I think it gets at this question of sort of like diversity and sort of this fractured notion of what these ideas and philosophies are, and how they change over time. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about that so I can take notes and
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really like what you mentioned early on. You mentioned the issue of translation. I think for both of us, when we're looking at translation, we're really looking at a very nuanced process of negotiation. In this process, both host language and guest language, you can see a lot of agency, right? Agency in this process. It's an active process of engagement. And I would apply the same argument to the issue of Confucianism, because Confucianism is never stagnant, right? It's always self-evolving, and it's open to interpretations. And this goes back to the first assertion that I made in this conversation. I said, well, if you look at traditional China, a so-called Chinese tradition, is not necessarily stagnant, it is not necessarily xenophobic, it's not necessarily against modernity. Because one, at least in my case study, when I'm looking into so-called Confucianism, I'm looking at the different schools. There are different peoples who have different interpretations on this so-called inherited tradition, right? And I'm specifically looking at a group of people who came from a Changzhou region. And these people, they belong to a certain school of this hermeneutical tradition. So in other words, they're looking at the Confucian classics. And they have a very unique way to interpret Confucian classics. And this way allows them to embrace foreign ideas within the framework of Confucianism. And one of these people that is intellectually related to this network would be Kang Youwei, right? And he actually makes this case for China's reform, right? Basically, he argues, there's different stages of historical developments. And even we had the best in the beginning, but we lost it, right? So we could go back, but at the same time, the knowledge from the ancient past is not necessarily in China. It could be dispersed to other countries, right? So in other words, when we are studying Confucianism or when we're studying knowledge from the past, it's not necessarily say we don't have to deal with the foreign world. And these people, for me, ideas, this is not necessarily my expertise. Ideas a little bit weird, sometimes off, but when it comes to practice, these people are important people. These people, we know not much about them, but I do know something from your book, Gina. You talk about Zhao Yuanren, right? Yuanren Zhao, Dr. Zhao Yuanren, Professor Zhao Yuanren. He taught at Harvard and Berkeley. He's one of the most brilliant linguistics in Chinese history and probably in world history, right? And he came from that lineage because his uncle is the person who was helping my author to write the first book in Chinese language on ancient world history in China in 1901. So you can see this very interesting network. And this author, his name is called Zhou Weihan. His grandson is Professor Zhou Wenzhong, who is one of the first music professors from China. Right? He's a Chinese American, and in the 1950s. And his disciples included Bright Sheng, if you know Sheng, Bright Sheng, and Tan Dun, these famous musicians. But when we're looking at this sort of lineage, we're now looking at the resist. So the Confucianism on the opposite of modernity. I'm looking at these individuals. They apply some Confucian dynamics and to exercise modernity in a very successful way, right? I'm not sure about your case, but I do see lots of connection.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so fascinating. And I could talk about Zhao Yuanren all day. And I'll include him. We have a question from the audience that I'll go ahead and read aloud. And I'll include talking a little bit about Zhao Yuanren, who is, I think, is often called sort of the father of Chinese linguistics, and did teach at Harvard and then Berkeley for most of his career, which is where his personal papers are. So the question from the audience is, and thank you audience for questions, please send more of them. So can you say a bit more about what sort of influence organizations of Chinese outside of China influenced thinking about languages in China over the 20th century? So this I think it's at this core question of sort of translation versus invention, but it's impossible to ignore just how much in particular sort of not only state builders, but also just like linguists or people who fashion themselves as academics of sort of the study of linguistics were absorbing and reinventing for China knowledge from outside of China, right? And Zhao Yuanren is a really good example of this, but I'll come back to him in a minute. There's a lot of things we could take from here, but I think that the core important thing that really shakes things up in China is two things, right? First is that after in 1839 to 1842, right? England goes to war with Qing China. Qing China loses. This is one of the reasons that the United Kingdom had the colony of Hong Kong up until 1987. But what comes out of the loss of that war is that missionaries from the UK and then increasingly also the United States and Scotland and other places could come to China. And a lot of them started sort of writing about these local languages that they saw. Another thing that we start getting in the 19th century are not just missionaries, but also sort of like diplomatic people or people who sort of fashion themselves China hands, right? But these mostly men, not all men, but mostly men, right, who were looking at China and trying to sort of make sense of the world around them. And one of the things that they really emphasized was that they didn't know what the Chinese language was. Like they didn't know if it existed, and if it did, sort of what it was. And they were filtering this through the metaphors of their own experiences, right? And so one of the things they focused a lot first on is sort of the written language. And they're like, the language that most people use to write is sort of this, it was called classical Chinese, right? That's what they called it. And they sort of thought of it as something like Latin, which they then said, well, this is a dead language, right? And so it's not living, it's not connected to the oral vernacular. And they're like, okay, well, so that can't be a Chinese language because it's old and dead and doesn't connect to sort of the oral language. And then they said, well, then what about the oral language? Well, there's this sort of court language that's spoken in court. Maybe that's it, but only really elites speak it. And even then, a lot of elites don't, right? And so then you have all of these other, sometimes they call them dialects, sometimes they call them vernaculars, right? But they were essentially trying to make sense of this language through the lens of nation building, right? And sort of, so the big thing that sort of comes out of that, right, is the idea that like, well, then China's just not a nation if it doesn't have a national language. And this is a criticism that a lot of like late 19th century, early 20th century Chinese thinkers took really seriously, right? That it's like no one's going to take us seriously as a modern nation that can fend off imperialism, right? That can fend off European countries that want to come and start wars with us if we don't have a standard language, right? So that, or like a national language, if we can't say this is the Chinese language. So I think that that's a big sort of influence there too. The other is a little bit more academic, and so bear with me here as I kind of try to explain this. But there were sort of a number of, some of these men were missionaries turned sort of intellectuals, some of them were just like scholars, but they were really fascinated with China because they had been trained in comparative linguistics. And sort of at the core of comparative linguistics was this idea that sort of languages connect to one another kind of like a biological taxonomic tree, right? And so it's like English comes from like English sort of stems from like this body family of languages, right? Like and at the top here there's Indo-European, and like other languages sort of stem from that, right? And that is how languages relate to one another. And there was a belief that the more languages you understand, the better you can sort of reconstruct and understand this core root, sort of like language like trunk, I guess you could say, right? And so, but this idea that there's a hierarchical taxonomical relationship between languages was also something that I think that Chinese linguists and academics took very seriously, in particular because a lot of them trained in the United States, and also sort of France and the UK, but like the core men who then went back to China and founded Chinese linguistics departments at universities, founded journals to write about Chinese linguistics, published books about Chinese linguistics. Like a lot of these guys went to universities in the United States, right? And so an example of this is the person that Xin Fan mentioned, right, which is Zhao Yuanren. So Zhao Yuanren, had this really incredible lineage, and then went to Cornell in 1911. I think I'm right on the date. 1910, might have been 1910. And then with a bunch of other sort of men that ended up being really, really famous, right? Did his doctoral work at Harvard, and then that's where sort of he got his training in this. And so he wrote the very first, I guess you could say, sort of like fangyan study that the men around him and sort of the academic community in China considered to be first modern linguistic study. And it was based upon this taxonomic model. And I think that's really important, right? Because if you consider that there's this taxonomy here, then that means that all of these Chinese languages have to connect to something. And none of them were arguing that it connected to the national language, but they also recognized that the national language, which is arguably sort of this fangyan like any other, had a different status. And so you have these politics mixing with these academic pursuits, right? That sort of just muddled things, I think, together. But I think sort of to answer your question, audience member, I would say that these two things are things that are really being absorbed and reinvented in China, which is first the idea that a nation has a singular language, right? And the second is that there's this taxonomical hierarchical relationship between languages and dialects. I hope that answers your questions. Please do send more.
This is great because when I was reading your book, I was fascinated by this part. And now I actually have another question for you to just follow up on this. Because when you are dealing with this sort of structure of knowledge, right? This is the structure of knowledge about Chinese languages. And definitely there's this Western influence, the people who are educated in the West, especially in the United States, and the missionaries who came to China. No, but the thing in China, like, Confucian tradition that you asked me about.
Sorry, I think I missed the question.
How the indigenous intellectual tradition, like you asked me about Confucianism, right? So that's it has something to do with this like formation of a new knowledge system about China. Is there any sort of relationship with Confucianism or something else in China? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is really fascinating, actually. So that I see a lot less talking about Confucianism, right? But one of the things that does come from sort of like indigenous modes of knowledge production, which is fascinating because then later on they say it's all outdated and not useful, but they're clearly absorbing it as well. Is that, I mean, so like it's not like people into the place that today we call China, they didn't just start talking about their languages in the 20th century, right? They've been talking about their language for a really, really long time, in part because, I mean, oral languages, very much sort of evolve, but China's script has not evolved all that much. I mean, I know that there are probably very knowledgeable linguists who would say like, no, it's evolved. But I mean, the core sort of like structure of this script has not evolved a ton for a very, very long time. And so there has been sort of like a question of how script relates to phonology that scholars have talked about for a really long time in China. And it comes in sort of a variety of different ways. One of them is that there's these productions of what are called rhyme tables, right? Which is essentially, there are a lot of homophones in the Chinese language, like characters that are pronounced similarly, right? And there's a lot of sort of like creations of tables of characters that are pronounced the same, right? And that are put into these different categories of phonologies, right? And there's various ways of sort of slicing and dicing them up, right? but you know, and sort of like we have this in modern linguistics as well, like, you know, frictives and like these kinds of things, right? And so those categories exist, and in very much sort of frame the way that like dialect surveys are being done, or fangyan surveys are being done, in the early 20th century, right? Is and the second thing is that in particular, starting in sort of like ooh, yeah, this is a similar question that I can, yeah. There's no question. I'll finish this first. Um,
Yeah.
is that there is a, ooh, so starting in like the 16th, 17th century, there is this sense in which phonology is more important than script in understanding how, like, this is really technical, in understanding what texts mean, because people used like borrowed characters a lot. And what I mean by that is like, let's say I have this Confucian text and it's really important, right? And I'm analyzing it character by character by character. There was a sense in which that if you really wanted to understand it among sort of a group of scholars in like the 17th, 18th centuries, you needed to know how that character was pronounced, because it was possible that that character doesn't mean the same thing that it did 2,000 years ago, and we'd get closer to that if we knew how it was pronounced. So there were all of these studies about like sort of tracing the diachronic oral history of Chinese languages to get at that. And that sort of notion, the idea that oral languages evolve over time, is really important to Chinese linguistics. And like in contemporary linguistics, they'll say like those guys were really outdated and we use new scientific methods, and they weren't scientific. But that sort of idea of how languages evolve and the categories they use to slice up phonologies really very much clearly are like a part of their knowledge production. So we have another question here. What is the relationship between the written language and dialects? Great question. So let's see if I can sort of break this down. So essentially, most Chinese fangyan or dialects are written using like the Chinese script, right? So if you like, if you went into your computer and you translated something into Chinese, it would come up with a Chinese script, right? These characters are rather phonetically flexible. They're not ideographic, right? They have a connection to phonology, but they can be pronounced a number of different ways, right? So, for instance, in like the same character, right, in Mandarin might be pronounced shi, but in Cantonese might pronounce sick. And that is, I don't speak a ton of other fangyan, but like you would have like different kinds of pronunciations for that same character, right? And there's a lot of debate in the early 20th century about sort of not just oral language reform, which is what my book is focused on, but there's also this whole debate about script reform. And one of the things that happens here is that because like there's a sense that Chinese characters can absorb the oral diversity of China's oral languages because they're phonetically flexible. Whereas if you try to just like take away the Chinese characters and use like a Roman script to write it out, that would narrow considerably the sort of like kinds of Chinese languages that script could accommodate. And so there's a lot of debate about that. There's also, to sort of get a little bit technical here, there are a lot of Chinese fangyan, in particular in the South, where they're really very different, right? There will be sort of grammatical structures that are different than Mandarin. So if I transcribed Cantonese, like I could use Chinese characters, but the character that would like sort of use for like the word to be or myself, right? Like that character in Cantonese is different than it is in Mandarin, right? So there really is sort of also distinct grammar and distinct vocabulary, and so that is also there, but they still use the same script. Sometimes there are times also where, especially in sort of like lesser written down fangyan, where people will just use like other characters as like, well, this one sounds like this one, so we're just going to borrow that in. And so that I think is a really complicated answer to your question. I hope that answers it. If not, please ask a follow-up question, and I'd be happy to sort of get that. Yes. There's another question, and Xin, I think I'll throw this one to you.
Let me just look at this question. In the discourse, you presented how permanent is the notion of a clearly defined Chinese nation that transcends the state. In other words, this is not dependent on representation by the state or geo-body to gain the specific Chineseness? Oh, this is a great question. This is a really great question. I think my approach, right? So I'll try to engage the question. I'll open up the conversation. I'll see what do you think, right, Gina, about this issue. For me, I guess when we're looking at this definition, so-called Chineseness, which is pretty much opens up the all the possibilities. I mean, there are different ways, different interpretations, but we do need to look at the legacies and alternative intellectual genealogies that are being silenced by today's narrative and the discourse of nationalism. So China doesn't have to be a nation state, and the Chineseness doesn't have to be a spatial concept. And of course, when we're looking at what we're studying, especially in my book, I'm looking at the cultural understanding of Chineseness a lot, right? So when we're looking at this, we're looking at people like, for example, Lei Haizong or maybe Qian Mu, right? They argue that Chineseness is not necessarily about the territory, it's not necessarily about the government, it's not necessarily even about the people. It's the spirit, right? And the spirit that is very much comparable to the European concept of culture, especially the German naive culture, right? Because this is a subjective nature, right? You can see this is almost itself ontology. It is a spiritual being that is operating with its own agenda, unfolding in the universe of global space and time. Right? When we're looking at this issue, we can see a lot of converging points between the sort of Chinese tradition and especially German understanding of the nature of culture. And a lot of people will say this is very much, this is too metaphysical, but this is the idea. I guess we can leave the conversation whether or not this is whether or not this is metaphysical and what it really means, right? This sort of Chinese spirit. But the thing here is lots of people in China over the course of the century, they do believe in it. And this will lead to consequences, and sometimes unintended consequences in the social practice of knowledge production, right? So when we're looking at the history of China, so in what way this is the history of geography? Because my people would argue, for example, Lei Haizong will argue this is not about geography because geography belongs to geology, geological time, right? And the Chinese culture, right, has its own logic. And on that point, I think the interesting fact, at least according to my case studies, is they're bringing up the teleological thinking of national history that came from this Eurocentric point of view, right? So they opens up all the imagination's possibilities. For example, some people in China argue culture is not necessarily subject to linear time. So in other words, the history of culture runs like a cycle. It comes, it goes down, and perhaps there are rebirths, right? So I guess this question reminds us the legacy, the very rich legacy that hasn't been fully explored by historians today, that is alternative to the narrative of a nation state as a spatial entity. So what do you think? This is a great question. I really love it.
Such a great question. And I'm going to sort of attack it from two, like breaking apart two things, right? The first is that Chinese in English is an ambiguous term, right? Because it can refer to somebody who is a citizen of China. It can also refer to somebody who sort of sees themselves as ethnically Han or ethnically Chinese, right? And so when we think about Chineseness, right, it's a term that actually originates from Chinese diaspora studies in thinking about, is there this sort of core, like, what it means to be Chinese, that unites us no matter where we live. And I think Xin pointed out, right, that scholars, I find, are sort of suspicious of the like actual existence of this, but people buy into it, right? And then there's the question of sort of state versus geobody. And I would argue, again, there's a lot of overlap here, right? Just like there's a lot of overlap between sort of ethnic Chinese and Chinese like citizen, right? And there's a lot of overlap here between state and geobody, but I'd also argue that sort of if we look at the margins, right, there's a lot of sort of tension and debate about that. And I'll just bring up a couple of examples here, right? And then I want to very quickly sort of answer this one last question that we have here. I think I can do quickly. So the first thing is that, so I have there in my book, I talk a lot about people who are very against the idea of this homogenous idea of what it means to be Chinese. That today is very much sort of like enforced by the state of the People's Republic of China, and they're very clear about this, like that there's like one way to be Chinese, and it involves being sort of like basically being culturally Chinese, so speaking Mandarin, right? And also sort of like geographically Chinese, and so they use that to extend to sort of like diasporic Chinese and such like that. There's an ethnic element, but they tend to downplay that a little bit, even though that's very clearly there, right? There's like a Han supremacy element to this. And then loyalty to the state, right? And so I spent a lot of time studying and living in Hong Kong, right? And in Hong Kong, there's a lot of discourse of like, you're Chinese, why are you protesting the state, right? So there is that narrative that exists, and there are people who attack it from all angles, right? There are people who attack this idea of like, you have to be politically loyal to the PRC state to be Chinese. I think we see that in Hong Kong, right? There is pushback against this idea of sort of the broader borders of the People's Republic of China. There's sort of a tint in particular to sort of like people who are really proud of Cantonese, who tend to be like, well, we're the oldest Chinese language because we are connected to this historic heart of the Chinese heartland, and we're like our language is less influenced by outsiders, which is very sort of like an ethno-nationalist narrative that actively tries to leave out border areas, right? That like they're less Chinese than we are. And so that is an articulation of Chinese nation that transcends, I think, the current geobodies of the state, right? And then there's this sort of like pushback against the idea of like, who owns this culture, right? Is it the government? Do they get to define it, or do we, right? So I think that when you sort of break apart this one homogenizing narrative from the PRC state of political loyalty, sort of like citizenship, and these cultural practices, you see people attacking it from all sides. So we have to end up the session. There's one last question. This is, how do you see the future of Chinese dialects like Sichuanese? Is the decline inexorable? One sentence, I don't think anything is inevitable, but if you would love to email me, and my email's in my book, please, can go more into that, but I don't think anything is inevitable.